Good morning, Warsaw. Today is Friday, 15th September. It will be sunny in the morning and cloudy in the afternoon with highs of 9 degrees Celsius or 48 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:26 a.m. and sunset at 7:08 p.m. We are on the 46th day of the Warsaw Uprising, and I can hear Berling's army approaching the banks of the river Vistula.
Yes, you're right, Philippe. They are approaching the banks of the river Vistula, and Roger will tell us a little bit more about that in a moment. But before we do that, let's talk about what's happening else on the ground. So we have the Śródmieście. Downtown, there's a lot of heavy fighting continuing. The insurgents are maintaining their positions, especially in the Czerniaków district, and they're basically holding strong. In the Żoliborz district, there's heavy artillery and a lot of mortar fire happening on the German side. They're targeting the insurgents, and there's air bombardment all throughout the day. The Germans managed to occupy the citadel, which is up in the northern part between the Żoliborz district and the new part of the old town. So that's captured today on this day, and it's taken. Germans are still continuing mass murder of any occupied buildings that they take. So from civilians to hospitals, everywhere and anywhere, as they take street by street, building by building, they're continuing to murder the civilian population and insurgents on their way. And before we move on, I want to talk about an insurgent that becomes quite important in the history of the Warsaw Uprising, and that's Andrzej Romocki, codename Moro. Or Moro. He's probably one of the most famous commanders during the Warsaw Uprising. He was born in 1923 to a very patriotic family. This is a subject that comes up on and on and on throughout some of these insurgents, the people that die during the occupation. They're very patriotic, and Claire will probably agree. Same with Zoe, Elżbieta Zawadzka. She was also patriotic. She came from a patriotic family. His father and grandfather both were given the Virtutu Militaris, so the highest order in Poland. They both had them. His father was a minister in pre-war Poland, and he died during the occupation. He was hit by a car driven by a German. Him and his younger brother Jan decided to follow in their ancestors' patriotic footsteps and began to work in the underground. And a typical repetitive story, Moro was a scout, a Polish scout. So he joined the Grey Ranks, which was predominantly made up of scouts during the occupation. And he became a commander of the Zośka battalion. We've come across this battalion many times before. And he takes over Rudy Company. He was very meticulous. He demanded order in his company, and he was very rigorous in the way he had things done. He was very picky, but that's not a bad thing necessarily for a commander. And he actually got called out for it by the Home Army Command, and he was basically sent off on leave. And then just before the Warsaw Uprising began, he came back to Warsaw. So his forced leave was cancelled. He then took over again as company commander. He fought initially in the Wola district, where we have all the massacres, and he also fought for some of the cemeteries as well. He was wounded a few times during the uprising. He was burnt on the 19th of August when Neulewaffen basically exploded, so he was quite burnt through one of those explosions. Then he was wounded again on the 31st of August. He was shot in the nose, so basically the bullet passed through the bridge of his nose and exited through his cheek. And this was while he was running across one of the major streets. But he continued fighting. He was promoted to the rank of second lieutenant and then lieutenant in the Home Army. And it's on this day that he's killed. And Roger will tell you a little bit more about Berling army and what's happening on the banks of the river Vistula. But he was killed while in Czerniaków, in the district that's currently under heavy attack by the Germans. The story is nobody really knows realistically how he dies. We're going to give you a testimony in just a moment, but you can make up your own mind to where you think this happened. So some people believe that he died during German shelling, and there's also a version that he was killed by a Polish soldier from the landing Soviet forces, or a sniper from the right bank of the river Vistula, or the river Wisła. And the reason people speculate this had happened, and it was most likely because he was wearing captured German camouflage jacket, the Panther jacket. And the reason for this being is that back at the beginning of the Warsaw Uprising, I think we talked about it on episode 4, or was it episode 3, where the insurgents had captured warehouses, and this became their kind of iconic uniform during the Warsaw Uprising. You can see many photographs of insurgents wearing this. The problem here is that he may have been mistaken for a German, and that's why he was shot. So we don't know. It has never been confirmed to how he died initially, but he was exhumed in the autumn of 1945, and he's buried in the Zoszka battalion section at the Powązki Military Cemetery. He's also buried between his younger brother Janek, who was wounded on the 12th of August and died on the 18th, and his cousin Stanisław Leopold, who was killed on the 25th of August, who was a commander of a different battalion, and he was also killed. So he is buried more or less with his family. So let's have a listen of Bogdan Cieliński, who talks about the death of Andrzej, codename Moro.
The girls went to sew a red and white banner and probably made it from a piece of red pillowcase. Andrzej ordered the Berlinians not to mistake us for Germans because of our clothes. This banner was to be distinguishing mark of the insurgents. He told me to take some soldiers and go with him to find those who came in boats because I was the only one who saw one of them. We left the gate next to the house and went on to Wilanowska and Solec streets. There was silence. Leszczyk and I went to a modest house nearby. He started waving this banner through a hole in the roof. We shouted that we were Poles. We didn't know that the Germans had taken up position near the sailing club's house, which was several dozen meters away from us, so they fired at nearby bank of the Vistula. We didn't know they were there. Śpioch came out first. Several shots were fired at him, and he retreated. He said we couldn't go any further because there was gunfire. Andrzej Moro asked him how shelling could happen if there were no Germans. He moved forward in a straight line and got hit. He fell. Sometimes he took too many risks. If he had believed Śpioch, maybe he would have survived. Despite the gunfire, Zosia Sadowa crawled to Moro and from a distance gave us a sign with her head that he was dead. She came back. There was no way to bring Andrzej back and bury him. I think that Andrzej Moro was killed by the Germans because we didn't see any Berling soldiers at the time.
That was a very interesting testimony. But Claire, there are more capitulation talks happening on this day, aren't there?
So it's day 46, the 15th of September. It's actually 4 days since General Komorowski, the head of the Polish Home Army, had suspended the capitulation talks with the Germans. And we know since that time that Stalin is still trying to keep the uprising going, still trying to keep the Poles fighting the Germans, hoping that there'll be losses on both sides that would support his ends. The Red Army has been advancing and the Germans have retreated across the Vistula to the western side of the city, destroying all the 5 bridges, including the rail bridge behind them. And General Colin Gubbins in Britain, he's the head of SOE. He had been in Poland. He had a special interest in Poland. He'd been out there with a military mission in 1939. He'd been among those people coming through Lvov into Romania to France to get back to Britain right at the start of the war. So he's keeping an eye on things, and he actually writes about the terrible betrayal of the Soviets at this point. And he says, the Soviet armies, by now up to the very walls of Warsaw, withheld all aid and succour. But is that the case? I mean, they've had these rather cynical airdrops coming down, but they have been providing some supplies. It's a bit of a balance for them, isn't it, between supplying them too effectively, where they could use those arms against the Soviets themselves, perhaps, or not supplying them enough so that the Germans can walk all over them. You know, what they want is to puncture the German defences. So they're trying to get that balance right. And this is when they bring in the Polish Communist Force, the Berling Army. You were talking about that army earlier, weren't you, Roger? Tell us what they start doing now. Do they do anything?
Yes, Berling Army sort of comes into its own. As we said yesterday, they had been involved in that sort of clearing of Praga, the sort of mopping up operation in Praga over the days that preceded today. And then they have big operation over the night of the 15th to cross the Vistula to actually try and provide direct aid to the insurgents in Warsaw on the West Bank. Now, as I said before, the Berling army was, to a large extent, one would have to say, without wanting to necessarily sort of tar the entire unit, but it was to a large extent a sort of propaganda operation. A unit that was made up of ethnic Poles. And those, particularly, as I said before, have been deported in 1940 mainly into sort of Siberia and Kazakhstan and elsewhere, and then rounded up and sort of put into Red Army uniform after the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Was a unit made up in that way was always going to be sort of prone to be used for propaganda purposes, and this was no exception. So its first operation actually was thrown into the battle at a place called Lenino, of all things, in October of 1943. So only not even a year before they appear outside Warsaw. That was their baptism of fire. And most tellingly, Lenino is a small town in Belarus now, near Mogilev. And the sort of propaganda significance of Polish men fighting for a town named after Lenin, you can see how that's sort of catnip to a Soviet propagandist. So you can see from that example that they were always going to be used for sort of propaganda purposes, if not first and foremost, then at least second on the agenda. And of course, for them to be the ones that fight for Warsaw, the Polish capital, to ultimately perhaps even liberate Warsaw, this is sort of perfect propaganda manner for the Kremlin. So they're sent across the Vistula. As we said, the bridges have been destroyed, so they're going across effectively in small boats and so on to try and set up a bridgehead on the western side. Of course, all of which under heavy German fire. Like so many Red Army operations, which they improved as the war went on, but very often they seem to be more characterized by sort of, if you throw enough men at something, then you'll win in the end kind of attitude. You can see that sort of strategy, if such a thing can be called a strategy. You can see that playing out with the landings of the Berling army. It was poorly planned, rather hastily, rather clumsily carried out. In many cases, the soldiers that managed to establish that bridgehead on the western side sort of found themselves without commanders or with a lack of command, and certainly without communications. The degree of support that they had from their confreres on the eastern bank in the Red Army was rather limited. So they're really it's rather chaotic. They're to a large extent left to their own devices, and it becomes really a bit of sort of a suicide mission to a large extent, because they're all the time, it's rather poorly carried out and under heavy German fire. And of course, as I said, few of them actually had combat experience, so they'd only actually entered the fray at Lenino less than a year before. They'd really been held back from frontline operations since then, because that operation itself had been rather disastrous for all the same reasons. The soldiers themselves were inexperienced. The degree of support and cooperation with neighbouring Red Army units in that battle had been really ill considered and ill carried out. So really, the vast majority of those soldiers that participated in that operation, brave as they may have been, ended up being killed. So total losses, we'll talk about this later on in the month, but total losses are really quite substantial. Somewhere up to about nearly 4,000 soldiers, and only a tiny minority ever make it back to the east bank of the Vistula. So this is it's a very significant moment in terms of both the strategy and the propaganda of what's going on, but also it's a significant moment in terms of militarily, that large numbers of soldiers are crossing that frontier for the first time, really, to try and assist the insurgents in the West. However much strategy is secondary to politics here, and actually it costs Berling himself his command, because it was considered such a sort of farrago, a chaotic farrago, that Berling himself loses his command. He's withdrawn to the rear. He's actually sent back to the military academy, which is the ultimate humiliation, you could say. So really significant day in the history of the Rising.
Thank you so much for joining us on day 46. Please join us tomorrow for day 47. We have about less than 3 weeks left of this podcast, and it's been amazing, all the support that we've been receiving. And remember, if you do like us, please go rate us on your favourite listening platform. Thank you to everybody who's been rating us on Spotify, and don't forget that you can also rate us on Apple too. So I know we have quite a lot of listeners on the Apple platform. It would be great to be able to get your ratings too. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you for day 47 tomorrow.